Gracias. Hola, Ekoparty. Cerveza, muy bueno. Lo siento, olvidó todo mi español. Ahora aprendo sueco. So I'll be speaking to you today about pointer subterfuge, and we'll get into the details of what I mean by that. A bit about myself. The way I got into computer security was when I was 16 years old, I went to a Swedish website where they gave you credentials to a Linux machine and you had to break into it and get root and things of that nature. I guess over there we have some CTF players. I'm a huge fan of CTFs, so I'll distract them because they're trying to focus on challenges right now. Good luck with the CTF. And now I work at Spotify. It's a music streaming company. And we have offices in New York and Stockholm. I really like a lot of things in the computer security field. One thing I really like is trying to raise the bar, trying to push boundaries, find where those boundaries are in the first place, and challenge people to think a little bit more deeply about what they're doing and why they're doing it. I don't like noisy signals, and I really dislike fragile software. Maybe a lot of people here have this problem that when they try to use a computer, stuff just breaks on them for no reason. Everything is crashing all the time, nothing works, it's very frustrating. And I was actually at Ekoparty in 2012, and I was here to speak to you about transistor reverse engineering. If you guys are interested in that, there's a link to some of the materials from that presentation, and it's an introduction for newbies to learn how to reverse engineer CMOS transistors. And earlier this year, I spent a lot of time looking at mobile messenger security, and it's still not very good in a lot of places. This research on browser hardening started out this summer, and I actually have a research partner, Jared. Right now he's in Cancun for his brother's wedding, but you can see he's still working hard over there. He's not here with us, unfortunately. And this is what the talk is going to look like today. First, I'm going to talk to you about the motivation for browser hardening. Why are browsers secure enough already? Maybe they are. Maybe they're not. Maybe there's more that should be done. And why should we do those things? And then the kinds of bugs that I'd like to focus on for this research, the bugs that I think are maybe more critical, or they just come up more often. So if those can be knocked out, it'd be a good thing. And I'll talk very briefly about the kinds of mitigations that are there, and maybe why they don't work, and then some ideas for new mitigations that vendors could be doing to frustrate exploit writers even more than they are today. And along with this research, we're putting together some exploitation challenges for people to explore these hardening ideas and try to break them. OK, so in this room, there are actually quite a few people that are very, very good at writing browser exploits. A few people here have presented about this at conferences, and my goal is to drive them even crazier than they are. I want to make them go crazy in the head. I want them to feel bad about it, too. And I think an interesting thing about memory corruption in browsers is we actually have technologies out there that were pioneered by companies like Determina when they made their product. Companies that do program shepherding, where they can really protect control flow integrity. However, these things are not viable today because of a bunch of constraints. When you try to add protections, you take away from other places. You take away from performance. You take away from debugging. You take away from code verification, all these things. So although we have solutions today, we're not necessarily able to apply them in the real world because they have practical implications. But perhaps there are more things that we could be doing, and there are new ways to distribute software, to build software, to run software that we just haven't thought of yet. That could go a long way towards making memory corruption in browsers less interesting than it is today. And browsers have pretty much taken over the world. You can find them probably in your toaster at this point. When I was in Seoul, the ATMs there were running Windows CE with some nice Internet Explorer screens. And if you look at operating systems and the way operating systems are evolving, they're re-implementing their entire UIs using JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So browsers are really kind of where it is today and where it's going on. From everything from consumer machines to enterprise to little embedded devices. And another interesting thing is that because all this stuff has moved to the web, all of these features have also had to move to the web. And there's an awesome website where someone kind of barfed with GIMP here, but the website's quite cool. You can't really tell from these screenshots. It's called evolutionoftheweb.com. And they graph the rate of features making it into browsers. Pretty much what you see is exponential development as all of these software powerhouses like Google and Apple and Sony and other companies have been contributing to browsers at pretty much an exponential rate. And there are many browser bugs, and they're being fixed, but maybe not fast enough because more bugs keep getting introduced every day. So, of course, there are many different kinds of bugs when you look at browsers. Logic bugs that might let you escape out into Chrome frame, go and download an app, that kind of stuff. But today, I'm really just going to focus on memory corruption flaws, because those seem to be the hardest to get rid of, and they're the most bountiful. And really, the root cause of memory corruption bugs is we're letting programmers shoot themselves in the foot with great languages like C and C++. I used to be a kernel developer writing C++ for the last 2 years, and I've seen a lot of stupid code. And I like auditing C and C++ especially. It's my favorite, just because of the sheer amount of ways somebody can mess up. It's very entertaining for a code auditor. And you have bugs like buffer overflows. You've all heard of those, I think. Also things like type confusion. Building a complex C++ program that's super object-oriented and awesome, and people are passing in objects across interfaces in insecure manners. Race conditions and use after free errors due to poor memory management. And here's just some sample statistics from about 6 months ago from Chrome. Out of 33 CVs they pushed out in one particular patch, out of all the CVs, about 33 of them were memory corruption. And of the 29 with details about memory corruption, 20 of those were heap trespass errors. So that's kind of where this focus is looking to go first. Things that are happening on the stack, other places, JIT problems, they're kind of going to be out of scope. And if you further pare down into what those heap vulnerabilities look like, about half of those were actually use after free errors, and a few were heap buffer overflows, and then some type confusion, and then some out-of-bound reads, which are not as exciting, but they're good for info leaks. And it's kind of interesting because although we have all these hardening mechanisms, browsers provide lots of good avenues for an attacker to have their way with the memory address space. So I prepared kind of a quick demo of what it would look like to bypass ASLR. So the interesting thing is many of these heap vulnerabilities can be repurposed. If you look at how the way browser exploits are written, you'll have a use after free. Well, it turns out that can be used to create primitives, to read memory, to write to memory. So one bug sometimes is all you really need to gain full control flow. And that's really different than when you look at exploiting a server remotely. If a server has this type of error, you're not going to be able to run JavaScript in the address space of that server to start playing funky games. And we'll get into them a little bit. But one of the most common avenues that attackers will go for is with the use after free bug is they'll try to just overwrite the vtable pointer to point to their own control data to hijack flow control that way. If you're not familiar with C++, vtable stands for vtables are virtual tables, and they're an abstraction that are used in the C++ ABI to make virtual method calls. It's kind of how inheritance and things like that are implemented. If you have a static class with static members, you're not going to have a vtable. But if your objects have polymorphism, they're going to have vtables. And they're basically pointers to code and data. So I've actually prepared a special build of Chrome for you guys, and I'll give you directions where to get it later. See how that looks. And I've taken one of my least favorite HTML elements, the marquee, and I added some features to it. that will let you read and write bytes in the heap, both at relative and absolute addresses. And the point of this really is if you have access to memory contents from JavaScript, ASLR, NX, these things don't really matter because you can very easily discover where code is and start building a ROP chain. So this is just checking out some heap addresses. You can get this build, try it out for yourself pretty soon. Over here, you just have a bunch of pointers in the heap. One of these, the first one here, is actually a vtable pointer. And following the pointers in there, you'll get a virtual method call. And dereferencing that, you'll get to code instructions. So you can start building a payload that uses code here. Let's see. OK. So ASLR doesn't necessarily matter in the browser. Beyond that, you have a lot more going on. It depends on the OS, the browser vendor. There's a lot of heap hardening that's happened. People have tightened down the way their heap allocators work, so it's harder to attack the heap metadata. Similar on the stack, you have stack cookies. Some heaps have heap cookies. Lots of different clever games they're trying to play. The operating system vendors now provide for non-executable address spaces for data, which is good for stopping shellcode. And along with that goes address space layout randomization. You have vendors like Microsoft producing EMET, and competitors have products that try to harden the address space or detect anomalous execution, just like EMET as well. One of the more interesting defense mechanisms that's cropped up this year is isolated heaps. Because use after frees are still not really going away, vendors like Firefox and Chrome, they've looked at how to put their heaps in such a state that attackers can't easily perform their attacks. And my favorite is that finally we have vendors producing 64-bit browsers. Chrome was 32-bit for a very long time. Just this year, they started producing Linux, Windows, and Mac 64-bit builds available to the general public. And that should go a long way. And to get a little bit more into isolated heaps, they don't exactly stop use after free exploitation, but they make it a lot harder to control the data that is dangling somewhere. And they're actually probably one of the most promising hardening mechanisms that vendors have deployed. If you guys sit down and try to write a use after free exploit, really the hardest part is how to control heap contents deterministically, because there's a lot of stuff going on in a browser at once. And is anyone here willing to talk about their browser exploitation? Does anyone have any active browser exploits right now? You don't have to raise your hand. You can just give me a wink. So as some of you know, these mitigations aren't super effective, actually, with the right bugs. So it might be because your exploit uses a logic bug, or you're just leveraging JavaScript to do arbitrary heap arrangements. And in this talk, really what I'm going to be focusing on is, given the constraints that you have today in building a browser that has to have good performance, has to be debuggable, developers have to be able to use it, and it has to be able to deliver content well, what are some hardening ideas that we're not seeing today that we could be, specifically in the area of memory corruption? So we're going to make some assumptions that hardening mechanisms today really don't make. The first assumption is that attackers will be able to read the heap data. They will have relative reads and writes on the heap, as well as absolute read and writes. So with these assumptions, address space layout randomization doesn't really mean anything with the way that the heap is laid out today. Another thing that doesn't really mean anything is non-executable address spaces, because people can perform ROP, or they can go for the data that has certain logic for escalating privileges and things like that. And isolated heaps are kind of in this direction, at assuming that attackers will have some heap control, but they don't really try to prevent them. And there are two main goals between this hardening. The first is that it should actually be difficult to locate code for return-oriented programming. And the other one is exploring the heap should be pairless. It shouldn't be easy to start reading a few extra bytes after an object or before an object to try to get an info leak, because there could be a guard page there or something that will stop the exploit chain. And the hard part about doing hardening mechanisms in a browser is you have to really think about the rate at which these things are developed and the different goals they're doing. Every browser wants to be the fastest browser. They don't want to cut off any performance at all. And another one is that there are tons of crashes in development and all this stuff. And if you want to make a change, you basically cannot prevent people from getting their work done. So some ideas that have been out there, patents by Microsoft on IDR and things like that, those totally break debugging. So those require a lot of OS support as well as debugger and toolchain support. So those are really non-ideal for getting practical changes to happen. And most importantly, if you ask a browser vendor, what is acceptable performance impact for a change, it will tell you 0. 0. The only acceptable amount is something they can't measure, something within their tolerance. I assume this would be something like 5%, but if you think about it, 5% is actually quite big. If you have 100 ads on a page, that means you basically load 95. Not so great. And there are kind of four stabs where I think browser vendors should go. The first is start using 64-bit already. If you take a look at exploits that are out there today, you still have 32-bit Internet Explorer exploits that do something called spray and pray. On 64-bit, you get high entropy address space layout randomization. 32 bits looks tiny nowadays. And another cool thing about 64-bit is JavaScript actually has limitations with the way they represent numbers, and attributes are stored in different objects. And the upper 32 bits of a pointer actually won't come across that boundary. So attackers have to do more work for the information leaks, just because of some of the way the interfaces work in browsers. Operating systems also tend to have higher security standards for 64-bit processes than they do for 32-bit, so you get those for free. And when I started out doing this research, none of the vendors really had this enabled by default. Since then, Chrome has actually released 64-bit builds, which is really nice. And Windows has actually had 64-bit builds for a while. However, they're off by default, probably because of compatibility, and that's really kind of a shame. And the next thing is the heap should look more like a minefield than it looks like today. If you all played Minesweeper, that's what it should feel like when writing an exploit for the heap. Right now, that's not really how things work. It's very easy to start reading too far, creating a deterministic sequence of actions for preparing heap corruption to happen in just the right way to make exploitation easy. And this is an idea that I don't think anybody is doing today. And this is one of the main points of the research. Instead of vendors distributing one homogeneous build to all of their users, so Chrome, they have, I don't know, 100 million users, probably way more than that. And they all have the latest version with that one build, with all those relative offsets being exactly the same. Instead, vendors should produce multiple builds that they send out to customers. And they should be sneaky about the differences between these different builds. And this is not as great as having full code runtime randomization or install time, but it satisfies a lot of the constraints that people have. When you do stuff at build time, that's less likely to end up having serious performance impact versus runtime stuff that could affect load times or more. Another one is, when you're doing stuff at build time, you can have good code signatures for what you're producing. One thing that the software industry is trying to do today is get better verifiable software. So if your hardening mechanism breaks code signing, you ruin the forensics capabilities of researchers and teams. And the other one is compatibility. If your hardening feature requires an OS change, it's probably not going to happen unless you're working at that OS vendor. Even very simple stuff that vendors could do, like register reassignment, will change the game for an exploit writer quite a bit. If there are 16 builds of a browser out there, and they all have different register assignment for those routines that people are exploiting, that whole exploitation process ends up changing because the specifics actually matter a lot for what that particular register is at that particular time. In some cases, in one build, it may be exploitable. In another build, it might turn out, oh, that's actually not exploitable. And that's a very cheap change to make. And it's also possible to make very simple isomorphic code changes at build time for shifting around functions so that a ROP chain inside of a module for a particular build is going to have to be slightly different than another build. And that will really force attackers to go and build dynamic ROP chains, which is harder. And the next part is how to be sneaky about producing these builds. The way you do this is you try to develop something called pointer subterfuge. And the point of it is to make info leaks less useful than they are today. When an attacker starts reading random heap contents, they won't know what's necessarily a code pointer, what's a data pointer, or what's a trap pointer. And it's really about giving uncertainty to the exploitation process, about getting into that thought process and adding in some more wildcards, some more obstacles to overcome. And a really key part of this is decoupling code pointers and data pointers. You're not going to get rid of data pointers in the heap, but you're also finding code pointers there today. And it's trying to decouple these things so that data doesn't lead to code. And that's one way that you can make ROP a lot harder to do. There are lots of things in the heap. So heap libraries, if you're looking at the system heap, separate from a renderer heap or isolated heaps, you'll have tons of pointers to libc, libraries that came in, got pulled in. And those are pretty hard to get rid of. You also have vtables. Vtables have pointers to code. You have addresses just to the data itself. The data section will have global offset tables, all kinds of global function pointers, metadata for the linker. Again, all these lead to code. Just knowing one data pointer is usually enough to go and build a ROP chain. And the part about making fake pointers is how do you make them look realistic? Because if you're using a random value, you can use sampling to figure out, oh, you know what? Given the probability of seeing this value here, this one doesn't really make sense. It's fake. It's very hard to kind of come up with a magical pointer that looks right. And there's some more details on different ideas of how to do this over on my blog, and you can check that out later. And we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty details of how to do that. One thing that I like about the computer security community is this concept of having a proof of concept and working on it. Because the thing is that talk is cheap. Doing is fun. Hacking is fun, playing with something. You can gain a lot of intuition about a problem that way. So we've developed a set of challenges. And newbies are very encouraged to participate. If you've never done memory corruption exploit, you could start with this one, because it's actually pretty trivial. You can tweet at me or email me for pointers, or please see me around the conference. And this first set of challenges is for OS 10. We'll have Linux challenges in the coming months as well. And there are 3 phases to the challenges. So the first phase is I put together a vulnerable build of Chrome from the latest source tree with some artificial vulnerabilities. In the second phase, there are some little exploit me's. If you've done war games before, they're little 5-6 kilobyte programs, and the goal is to gain code execution in them. You can download those and play with them. And then there's phase 3, which is trying to do that first Chrome exploit using these hardening mechanisms, or trying to bypass the hardening mechanisms I'm presenting. And for now, the crafted vulnerability is very simple. It's a relative and absolute read over in the DOM heap. If you have ideas for more vulnerabilities that will be interesting, I'd be interested in adding those as well. And after we do this DOM stuff, we'll probably open up the renderer and other areas that I've seen a lot of vulnerabilities in the past. So do you guys know scrolling marquees? So like, if you travel back to 1999, lots of websites would have like the scrolling text. I really hate those. They're not very fun. So that's why I'm picking on this element. And I added a few different methods to it. For relative reads, relative writes, absolute reads, and absolute writes. Because it's a 64-bit browser you're working with, there are going to be two address parameters for the top and the lower parts of that address pointer. And you can download this at this link. I'll put up these slides on Twitter really soon, so it's a little bit easier to get. And this is a build for OS X that has this vulnerability. And if you check out that second link over there, that will have a demo page that shows you how to do relative reads. And your goal is to try to gain code execution using the writes and executes. Now for the second set, it's the hardening mechanism. So the hardening flow goes something like this. When building a binary, multiple builds are actually made from those build object files. And there are subtle differences between them where they kind of pair together in an interlocked way. And then at link time, the binary is produced in such a way that they have lots of guard pages in the data segments in such a way that they complement each other, where something that is legitimate in one binary is going to be a trap page in the other binary, but they'll be at the same addresses. And after link time, some blending of these builds comes together. So we can get fake trap pointers that are actually real pointers from one build and put them in another build where they will be traps. And when an attacker is dumping heap contents, they will be looking at both real and fake pointers, and they will be indistinguishable from one another when looking at them. So here's a sample V table. And you can see that the V table has actually doubled up in the number of methods. In between every pointer, this is a very basic scheme of how to do this, odd and even. So on one build, all the even pointers will be real function pointers, and all the odd ones will be fake. And the other build, it's the other way around, where the odd ones are fake and the even ones will be real. And this was implemented using Clang, basically. And then at link time, we get into what I was talking about, creating guard pages. So you can see in this diagram that data relatively to the binary stays fixed, but the location of code in the binary actually shifts up and down in the address space. And another thing is doing some really basic code isomorphism in the functions that are being produced. Just sliding up and down the actual contents of code, but keeping entry points of functions the same. Along with this, something more to be added will be register reassignment. And this work basically involves compiler work and linker work. There's no changes to the OS for the dynamic linker. There's no requirements for OS compatibility. This is all linker and compiler work, done as LVM patches right now. And OS X actually turned out to be a little bit tricky on the linker side. So if you guys are familiar with Linux, the GNU linker, all those support something called linker scripts. Gracias. Cerveza, muy bueno. OS X doesn't support linker scripts, so this turned out to be kind of a big pain in the butt to start modifying LD64 from Apple. And relocations for position-independent code actually required a bit of extra work as well. So you can get the second set of challenges at this link over here. And I can show you some of them right here. All right, so here we have one program with some really simple C++ code, just some very basic polymorphism. And this program will accept some commands for doing reads and writes on the heap. And these are built with pointer subterfuge. They're both the same size. All right, but if we check out what's been linked in here, there's some subtle differences. If we look at the load commands, they have different sized page 0 sections. If you look at where the code is being loaded, one binary has their code loaded at one address, and the other has it at a different address. And if you look at the data segment is loaded at the same address. All right, so say we have a bug that lets us start reading values on the heap. Can start dumping things, can go backwards relatively. And here, these binaries don't have position dependence on. And here's a vtable pointer right here. And if we dive into that, you can see some dummy values here. And then, you can see here two function pointer calls. One of these is real. So if you're good at x86, you can see that's a function prolog, 5548, blah, blah, blah. However, the other function pointer will result in a crash. And if you take a look at the paired build, what's real and what's false flips around. So the idea is, as a vendor, you ship out both of these binaries to your customers. And when an exploit writer tries to bypass ASLR and things like that, the information that they get out has lower quality than it did before. So that's the first challenge, to write an exploit for this. I have full confidence that you can solve all of these. And once you solve this one, it's the same thing again with ASLR enabled. And there's a third one that has more heap guard pages. That should kind of lock you in and make this a little bit more difficult to do. And the really nice part will be trying to attack builds of Chrome with this. So this is almost there. It's not quite ready yet, but it will be there on the website. What's left for this is actually building Chrome properly. We've kind of been bending the ABI a little bit in ways that make Chrome unhappy right now, but that will be fixed soon. Another thing is there are a lot of limitations with not being able to have linker scripts. So there are some alternate opportunities. So on OS 10, we're going to switch to using a different linker. And we're also going to produce these for Linux to try out exploitation there. And Linux has pretty nice linker scripts, so a lot of the pointer subterfuge will be much more easy to deliver. Another thing is we're going to open source our LLVM code for doing this. Right now, it's not really done the LLVM way. This stuff is not implemented in terms of transforms. It's basically if-def hacks. So we will fix that and share it with you to play around with. And there's more subterfuge to be done besides vtables and global function pointers as well. And then there's some fun ideas. So some of these concepts don't necessarily have to be done at build time. They could result in some kind of hybrid linker, runtime, ASLR technique that's a little bit different than what you see today. Another thing that would be really nice would be having major operating system support zero overhead guard pages. Instead of eating up 4 kilobytes of memory for a guard page, we could actually have the OS use page tables a little differently to have zero memory overhead page tables. But of course, that requires evaluating the impact on TLB and stuff like that. Another nice thing that people like Chris Evans have been talking about would be execute no read code. And that would make ASLR actually super effective if it was not possible to just dump code once you know its address. And there's a lot more heap hardening to be done as well to make it more perilous than it is today. Something else I've been thinking about is how is browser exploitation changing maybe? When it started out, it was very easy to just fill in a bunch of JavaScript heap with some opcodes, huge nopslet, spray and pray, go land it. Then you had the era of JIT sprays from Flash and other places, and as well as JavaScript JIT spraying. And lately, you just tend to see a lot of ASLR bypasses for ROP chains. But maybe technologies like EMET and other things are actually making people think about different things. And I think maybe the most interesting browser exploitation research that I've seen this year has been from Tomekeeper and Tyrannid. And what's interesting about their exploits that they've published is that they don't really necessarily go for the ROP thing. They're finding alternate ways of getting what they want that doesn't require a lot of code injection or building a ROP chain. And thinking about that direction and where they're going and how to stop those exploits, it's something that I'll be looking at as well. So this wraps up the presentation. Please check out the challenges on the website, and let me know if you have questions. I'd love to help you out. Muchas gracias.